Hey everybody, and welcome back to Fistful Cards. It's your best friend Lee Patrick Fair, and today we're going to be talking about the Tombstone World Tournament. Specifically, my list from that event. I got second place and went 7-1, and we're going to be talking about my Law Dogs Bounty Hunter deck. Some of the things that worked, some of the things that didn't. This isn't going to be a my overall experience in Tombstone kind of video. We're just going to be talking about the deck and kind of some of the things that worked and some of the things that I might change, if anything, if I were to do it all again. So to start off, what is this deck and who is it for? What is our goal? It's a Law Dogs Bounty Hunter deck. So it's not the craziest thing in the world in terms of overall concept. A lot of the pieces of it are going to be quite familiar. If you're familiar with our channel or just Doomtown in general, you'll know that Law Dogs Bounty Hunter is a classic staple of the game. So what my goal is with this particular deck is that I was looking at the Doomtown meta and noticed that there was quite a bit in terms of mid to late game sort of lockdown powerhouse decks in the meta. So there was a lot of setup to create incredibly frustrating mid to late game decks. So you've got things like Force Field, Harrowed Guys, Blessed, Miracle, Casualty Reduction. You've got Earmonger's Control coming back. You've got all these decks that are like, I'm going to get to a point where I've got so much stuff on the board that you won't be able to just play poker against me. And if you run out of gas, I'm just going to win through attrition. There's a lot of late game attrition based stuff in the meta currently. And so I was basically like, what can I do? What kind of deck can I play that will just completely either go around that or ignore that aspect of the game? And I thought all in early game aggression out of Law Dogs was the way to go. So that's basically what we've got here. Our goal is to kill as many of our opponent's starting dudes and prevent them from getting to the mid and late game. And so let's get started here. So to start off, we have our clubs. So I'm running 5, 8, 10 as my primary values with a few off value clubs, deeds, and dudes. Part of the issue, I guess, so to right off the bat, part of the issue of running these values is that you end up in a very difficult position when it comes to anti-cheating cards. Specifically, you sort of end up in a weird place where you either go all in on This'll Hurt in the morning or I'm Your Huckleberry, because 10 doesn't really have anything and I don't really have enough room for off values. I guess that isn't also an option. You can go lower on off value cards and grab yourself some like bottom dealings or something like that. But I decided to go with I'm Your Huckleberry. I'm Your Huckleberry is an okay anti-cheating card. The biggest problem with I'm Your Huckleberry is that it has an extremely big weakness, which is if your opponent fights you with a single dude, which is not common but does exist, you end up in situations where your opponent, you can't really punish your opponent, because if you take your opponent's dude with I'm Your Huckleberry and they no longer have a posse, then they end up in a situation where the shootout just ends. You don't lose the shootout, but you don't win the shootout, and that's not how you win games of Doomtown. Is you can't just like reset to neutral every time your opponent cheats. And so that's a bit of an issue with this card. On the flip side, I'm Your Huckleberry is probably one of the rudest cards in the game in terms of some of the setups that you can do with it. And I definitely played multiple games where I was able to I'm Your Huckleberry, steal their stud, combine it with Point Blank, steal their Willa May, things like that. You can do a lot of very powerful things with I'm Your Huckleberry. But also it has a very, very exploitable weakness if your opponent's deck is set up to where they can actually fight you with a single dude. So that worked out decently, but I kind of would have preferred Pistol Whip. And I think going through this list, one of the things I'm going to talk about is I think one of the values, specifically 10, probably could have been a different value. But to go through the rest of the list, Bounty Hunter is obviously amazing. It doesn't really need any introduction. It creates a stud dude, which is insane. That stud dude comes into play unbooted, makes a call out that can't be refused. That dude can be used for point blank. That dude can be used for pistol whip if you're doing that. That dude is a stud. That dude can casualty soak. So it basically just sets up huge amounts of power play. Something I didn't talk about, but it's kind of obvious, is that I'm running the Lawdog's Core Home. The Lawdog's Core Home is basically, I feel like there's very little argument to be made that it's probably the best dog's home. It is a home that very reliably and very consistently does the thing that most Lawdogs do and dogs decks want, which is make people wanted. Unlike something like Justice in Exile, which is very random, Lawdogs is very targeted. And so there's a reason why it's like consistently the most popular Lawdogs home, and it's because it just sets up all the things that the faction wants to do. It also is a 19 Ghost Rock home, which means that you can also make very, very powerful starting posses out of it. So you set up Bounty Hunters. This will hurt in the morning as a one of. I don't like running under 6 cheating cards in my tournament lists, and that's just a personal thing. If you wanted to run 4 Bounty Hunters, the only argument I have against that is drawing multiple Bounty Hunters a turn can be problematic economically, but other than that, this is largely there because I don't like losing games because I don't have access to a cheating card, so I just run 6. I run maybe more than the average Doomtown player does. Most Doomtown players have elected to sort of play on the respect that comes with cheating in Doomtown. A lot of players will just not cheat because they assume, but that's a topic for another video. So let's move on. We've got a 2-2 split between Too Much Attention and Unprepared. Basically, one of the decks that I was worried about going into this tournament was Legendary Holster or Shotgun, like a Gun Fu or something like that. And so I basically ran 2 of the 2 things that stop it. So Unprepared if I win lowball, and Too Much Attention if they win lowball. I think Too Much Attention is kind of slept on a little bit. It's a very powerful card in terms of, I think that if this card was not a 10 of clubs, it would be played in every Lawdogs deck that exists. But because it competes with Unprepared, and so a lot of people kind of just don't run it. I think as an off value, it's also very powerful. It lets you shut down certain strategies. Sometimes it'll let you shut down kind of like weird outlier strategies, like you could certain deeds and stuff that generate control points, and that sometimes can stop opponents' plans, like a Fortress deck or something like that. You can also boot Alley. There's some pretty powerful cards that exist in the game that allow you to that this card allows you to deal with, and I think that makes it quite powerful. Unprepared needs no introduction. It's obviously amazingly powerful, and Point Blank is also a card that we at this channel really, really love and run quite often. Point Blank basically allows you to just kill dudes, and it does so in a way that I think is not necessarily oppressive, which I can really get behind. In terms of Hearts was rough in terms of like it's not necessarily that the Hearts were bad, there just wasn't a whole lot of decision making with the values that I picked. Knights Chasuble, originally it was Pearl Hand or Revolver, but as you'll see when we go through the spades, like 99% of the dudes in the deck are actually studs already, so I swapped it out for Knights Chasuble. This card is fine. It's basically an influence bonus for your starting posse, so you can make bigger influence wanted dudes wanted. It doesn't really have any sort of like, I'm not worried about conditions, I'm not worried about value reduction. This card is fine. Pedro is very powerful, basically doesn't really have a downside, and it is a little bit of casualty reduction, and so why not? Jail's Guile, like I said, I wanted to have more anti-cheating cards. Jail's Guile is fine. It's not very powerful. It's okay. Scoop Hound was a meta decision based on fear of Willamay and Legendary Holster stuff. This card is okay. A lot of decks do have some way of getting people in and out of shootouts, whether that's Pintos or Stakes Just Rose or Willamais or Pistol Whips or something like that. And so just having an off button for those things can sometimes turn an entire deck upside down when your opponent is really relying on kind of a hit and run strategy, or just like a couple of powerful cards, or even just like being able to escape. You can use Scoop Hound to kind of shut a lot of those plays off. And so that's why I included a couple of them. You might include 3 if you're not too worried about the Jail's Guile. And like I said, I was worried more about kind of like mid to late game setup decks, which it's very easy to not get to the mid and late game if your opponent can't optimize their shootouts in the early game. So this card is quite powerful, even though it's kind of a weird meta choice card. In terms of deeds, there's not a whole lot to report. 5, 8, 10 is okay. 8 and 10 are a little bit funky because they have some deeds which are very strong, but they also have a lot of deeds that are not particularly strong. 5 is shaping up to be an extremely powerful suite of deeds. You can get some extra control points. You can boot some important cards. There's some pretty powerful cards in there. 8 basically runs out of steam right after this. Circle M, Gamora Gazette, Pat's Perch is okay. After this, you kind of are in a rough spot. 10s, it's these two, and then you are in a rough spot. I didn't want to run any of the cards that had like weird, the like mid values from like 6 to 10 kind of all have funky deeds. Like their diamonds are really, really bizarre. And at least 1 or 2 of every single of those values has like a weird outlier card, like, oh, this is a normal deed but it's controlled with bullets, or this is a normal deed but it has 0 production unless you have another ranch in play. And I just wasn't interested in anything that required setup, because I didn't plan for games to last that long, so I needed like immediate satisfaction out of the deeds, and a lot of these are that, or at least they're cheap enough to where it doesn't matter. So I threw in a general store instead of running a third 10. Originally, I was running Walter's Creek Distillery, and noticed that I really couldn't trigger it off of pretty much anything in the deck. There's like 1 or 2 things that exist, but I was like, once again, not particularly interested. And that brings us to spades. I'm running 17 spades. My starting posse was the thing that a lot of people were like, whoa, that's crazy town. So I guess I'll start there. I'm running Jake Smiley, Lucy Clover, Thunderboy, Willamay, and Henry Morin. Basically, I wanted to run as efficient but as cheap of a starting posse as possible. Law Dogs is a faction that there are a few factions in Doomtown, actually. I would say Law Dogs and Fearmongers are the most notable example of this, where they basically have like a set amount of starting dudes. Like the starting dudes are very obvious, and the reason that they're obvious is because the rest of the faction is very expensive. Specifically in Law Dogs, you're looking at like your Tommy Hardens, your Phillips, your Thunder Boys, your Father Telerios, and then right after that, everything goes up to like 5-1, 6-2, 7-2, 8-2. Like the price just goes really, really high. And so it's not like a faction like Sloan or Anarchist, where like a majority of the dudes in the faction are like 3 cost, 0 upkeep, 1 influence dudes. It's the opposite of that. And so because of that, we don't see a lot of variety in terms of Fearmongers and Law Dogs starting posses. However, the big thing that Law Dogs starting posses tend to do is they tend to sacrifice economy for brute strength. So you have your like Tommy Harden, Philip Swinford, Thunderboy, Hattie, Willa May starting posse. You have like really solid influence. You have really powerful dudes with like game winning abilities. Hattie's shootout action is super powerful. Tommy Harden's anti ability is powerful. Philip Swinford's cycling is very powerful. But that tends to leave you in a like 3-2 economy. Where you have 3 Ghost Rock and you make 2 a turn. And the problem with that if you lose low ball, so if you're playing a super strong structure with like pretty high values like I am, if you start to lose low ball, your decision making becomes extremely limited every single turn. Like you, instead of being able to do multiple things a turn, you can kind of do one thing a turn. So if I start with 3 money and I lose low ball, I'm down to 2 money. I make $2. All of a sudden, I'm not playing a deed and playing a bounty hunter every turn. I'm playing a deed or playing a bounty hunter. Now, in most Law Dogs decks, this is okay, because what happens is I survive for a few turns. I like the dude, make your guy wanted. I kind of roll a little bit of the board with my powerful abilities on my dudes, and I can kind of survive the first couple of turns. That way my economy gets like boosted up. So I basically like, okay, I play a deed on the first turn. We have a little bit of back and forth. My strong, powerful dudes protect my deed, and then my economy grows from there. And there's nothing wrong with that kind of playstyle, but it does feed into the mid and late game powerhouse decks that are currently very popular in the meta. So instead of doing that, I said, we're not going to do that at all. And instead, I'm going to start with basically the cheapest starting posse you make, and I'm going to all in you every single turn. And so I start with 10 money, 1 income, and 4 influence. Mathematically speaking, that means that if I lose or win low ball, I basically have more money on the first turn than many decks have in the first like 2 or 3 turns. And so because of that, I also start with 6 influence, because Jake basically has influence against everybody who isn't Fearmongers. But because of that, you can really ramp up the starting game and push that win condition that we talked about earlier, which is to just kill your opponent's dudes as fast as possible. Well, all of a sudden, I can drop like 2 deeds and a bounty hunter every turn because my economy is so hyperinflated at the beginning. Basically, I wanted to create a starting posse where I could play everything in my hand every turn. And it definitely did that. Even in the finals game, the deck never didn't do what it was supposed to do. So, and that I think has a lot to do with posse. Lucy obviously is primary to make someone wanted. Willa May and Henry are casualties. So Henry will help a little bit with low ball wins, but really don't want him to boot that often. Thunderboy is also extremely powerful. And Jake is obviously just there because against like something like Slide or something, he in terms of the rest of the 5 is pretty solid. Most of the deck is studs. 10 and 8 are not. 8 is not a bad value for dogs in general, but in terms of dudes, there's not a whole lot in terms of like really inspiring dude options. I'm running Francisco, but you get your like Steven and your Vasily, and then like Judge Harry is a powerful card, but he's so expensive. And I think that the Judge, like on a kind of a side note, I think that the Judge is what I look for in like an expensive dude. So if I'm going to run expensive cards, specifically expensive dudes, they better like hit the table and immediately change the like face of the game. And the Judge does do that. Basically, if the Judge hits the table, put your opponent on a clock where like I will kill a dude every single turn, and there's nothing really do about it, especially if you were already on the back burner. Francisco could be another Steven Wiles. I don't like doubling up on dudes, just as like a personal thing. You could definitely run 2 Steven Wiles, or you could run a myriad of other out of faction 8 cost guys like Igui or or Silas, or like, there's quite a few like 8 of spades dudes that are decent. I chose this one because he was like 5/1, 5 cost, 1 upkeep, 1/1, who could theoretically go get me a Pedro or something. He had nothing else. In terms of 10, after looking through the 10 dudes, I almost just like didn't run 10s at all. Because 10 dudes are kind of where 10 as a value for Law Dogs doesn't really shine through. I think if I were to do it all again, I would probably swap out 10 for like 2 or 7 maybe. But 10 dudes, you basically end up like Clyde is okay. Again, he's super expensive, but he allow you to win the game by his distance. You're all people out at home, so that immediately makes him an extremely powerful card, which again is what I'm looking for if I'm going to pay 7 rock for a dude. However, the rest of the 10 suite is either like weird dudes where it's like Doris, where like Doris isn't a bad card, but Doris is also not a good card for this deck. There isn't really a whole lot of movement shenanigans. There's not a whole lot of like ability to get Doris a bunch of control points, thing like that. And so I ended up just playing Clyde, which was fine. It helped my low ball. But like most of the 10 dudes are like 6/1s, 6/2, things like that. And I just wasn't particularly interested in doing that. And so I didn't. Like I said, going forward, I think if I were to make one, probably just swap ends. I'd probably grab Pistol Whip instead of I'm Your Huckleberry. Grab Bottom Deal, a primary anti-cheat, and I think that might have a little bit. It would definitely like change what the deck is good against. But I think with what we saw at Tombstone, been better off for the deck to do. Speaking of which, I am running some off value dudes. I just wanted something cheap, especially these 0 upkeep dudes, or these 0 upkeep dudes. Enrique is a super solid card, but I think he's actually a little too slow. I think I probably would have chose Hattie in hindsight. I probably would have had him as or her as the off value dude, just because I wanted. It's just really powerful to be like, okay, turn 1, I go Charlie's Place, Tommy Harden, and Bounty Hunter, and that is still within the realm of my economy. And I think that creates really, really powerful setup and starting turns, which I think is really the deck's whole point. So yeah, basically that's that. To talk a little bit about kind of how the day went a little bit. Like I said, the plan, basically, I ran into a lot of what I was concerned about, and the deck performed beautifully, even in the final game. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about the final game. So you can watch the final game. It's about 13 minutes long. And sitting down at that table, I imagine that we both knew, but I certainly knew that the game was going to be over in 2 days at most. And it was because basically what was going to happen in that game was either I was going to kill all of his dudes, or he was going to reduce my influence to 0. And I was going. And that was basically the only thing that could happen. And I killed the majority of his dudes. It's actually like a really funny game from like a competitive standpoint, because it's not it was like a good match in terms of like Doomdog David Hogg is like a great player, and like we had like it was like a angry game or anything like that, but it's like a bad game from like a competitive, if you're looking for like pure Doomtown. It's like the decks both were like aggressive, sort of like negative play, like all in, like super powerhouse decks. And I think that in the end his ended up snatching the victory. So good games there. But overall, I think that this is a super powerful deck. if you want to give it a shot, I would definitely keep on 5 and 8 and then try out some other values for that third value, or even just kind of copy this one, see how it takes you. And hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, consider subscribing and giving us a thumbs up for more Doomtown content. If you hated it, you can give us a thumbs down. Either way, we want to hear you in the comments section, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks for watching.